Good morning, everybody. We will go ahead and get started this morning. I have started recording. Welcome to the March session of the Daring to Learn value-added webinar series. My name is Alaina Boyd. I am an extension specialist with the University of Tennessee in the Center for Profitable Agriculture. If you have been with Daring to Learn in the past, you likely have recognized me from past sessions and the reminder emails you get about this webinar series. If this is your first time joining us for Daring to Learn, welcome. This is a monthly webinar series hosted by CPA. Our topics change from month to month, so we get different speakers in every month to talk about different topics. I am actually going to be the presenter for today. So for our March session, we're going to be talking about simplifying soap and cosmetic regulations for value-added producers. So this deals with laws in the United States related to soap and cosmetic products. If you are a first-time attendee for Daring to Learn, just a few kind of housekeeping things before we get started. So this webinar session will be recorded. We will post that to the center's YouTube channel at the conclusion of this session. So the recording will be available online. You'll be able to go back and watch that. On YouTube. And at any time, if you guys have questions, there are a couple of ways to ask those questions throughout the session. You can send messages in the chat box. I'm going to make sure that's turned on for you guys now. So you can drop questions into the chat. There's also like a Q&A feature or a way to like raise your hand if maybe you have a question that is a little bit too complicated to type. I can turn your microphone on and give you a chance to kind of ask that verbally. So we'll try to make this simple and easy to go through today. I know regulations are kind of hard to talk about. One other housekeeping thing for my Tennessee producers. So if you are a producer from Tennessee and you're interested in that Tennessee Agricultural Enhancement Program or TAEP educational credit, you do qualify for one educational credit for that application B for producer diversification for TAEP for participating in this webinar series, but that's just for our Tennessee folks. And I do see we have some folks on the call from the Philippines, so that's pretty exciting. There's a group of folks from a state college in the Philippines that have joined us. So I don't think it's morning where you guys are, but it's morning where I'm at in Tennessee. So good morning to you guys. We will go ahead now and get started. So I've kind of introduced myself already. We won't spend a lot of time on this. As I mentioned, I am an extension specialist with the Center for Profitable Agriculture. We're a department in UT Extension. My background's a little bit all over the place, but mostly in that communication and information space. So I work a lot in digital marketing, social media marketing, e-commerce, those sort of areas. This next slide is just a little bit of information about the Center for Profitable Agriculture. So we are a partnership between UT Extension with the University of Tennessee and the Tennessee Farm Bureau Federation. So anytime you see our CPA logo, we will also have that Farm Bureau logo at the end. And we work cooperatively with the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. This is just a quick slide with an overview of some of the center's value-added teams, so the extension specialists and other extension staff involved in our center. Not everybody, but most of them. And kind of as we get started into this content for regulations, just a bit of a disclaimer. So anything we talk about in this presentation is strictly for informational purposes only. And it also does not replace seeking legal advice from a competent legal professional. So I'm not a lawyer, strictly just here to share information about these regulations with you guys from sort of an informational standpoint. And this next slide is a content overview. So more of another kind of disclaimer in a sense. So this presentation will only cover regulatory considerations for what we call true soap and cosmetic products. So we'll explain that a little bit more in depth here in a few slides. We will not talk about how to make or create soap and cosmetic products. So strictly talking about just the regulations. Um, we also will not cover drugs at all. That's a product category recognized by the United States Food and Drug Administration beyond explaining and establishing when a soap or cosmetic product is considered a drug. So just kind of keep those in mind. And for my Philippine friends on the call, these are strictly talking about regulations and laws for the United States. Okay, so now that we've got those kind of disclaimers and caveats out of the way, we'll kind of move into answering what are soap and cosmetic products. So those are two different consumer product category types. Cosmetics would be considered anything from like lotions to lipstick, makeup, lip balm, um, salves, body butters, even detergents. So when we talk about detergents from a cosmetic perspective, a detergent would be anything that is not made through that process of saponification. So it's not a bar soap. Think like body wash that you would get at the grocery store or from like a retailer like Ulta. I know you can get body wash at several places like Ulta and Sephora. So those, even though we as consumers would commonly refer to those as soaps, they're considered detergents and cosmetics by extension in the eyes of regulators. So when we talk about true soaps in this presentation, we're talking about bar soap. So that's going to be any kind of soap that's made through that saponification process by combining fats and oils with an alkali. So those are just some kind of quick distinctions between the two. So, who regulates these products, soap and cosmetics, in the United States? The United States Food and Drug Administration handles all of the regulations for cosmetic products. So that includes lotions, makeup, skincare, etc. The United States Consumer Product Safety Commission handles the regulations for true soap products. So it looks like I've got a typo on this slide over here, but you can kind of ignore that. So Consumer Product Safety Commission handles those true soaps that we talked about, bar soaps made via saponification, and all other products, cosmetics, including detergents, makeup, skincare, lotion. All those things are handled by the Food and Drug Administration. So this next slide is just kind of a brief overview of some of the laws in the United States related to soap and cosmetic products. So you'll see this first one in 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was established. So that is the regulation that gave the FDA regulatory authority over food, drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics. And then in 1966, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act was enacted in the United States. So this deals with packaging and labeling considerations. And then in 2022, what we call MOCRA, or the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act, was established. So MOCRA is the most significant change to the FD&C Act, or that Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, since 1938. So we'll talk a little bit more about MOCRA in depth here in a couple slides and some things that go along with that. Um, But these are some of the big three when we talk about soap and cosmetic products. So, this next slide will start to go over how the regulators in the United States define soaps, cosmetics, and drug products. So, per the Food and Drug Administration, a product is defined as either a soap, a cosmetic, or a drug by its intended use. So, when we talk about intended use, this is literally whatever the manufacturer or the creator of that product intends for it to be used to do. Products can have more than one intended use, and it's also possible for a product to be a combination of one category or the other. So you can have a product that can be both a cosmetic and a drug. So it has cosmetic properties, but then it also treats or deals with some sort of illness or changes like the structure or function of the human body. We'll get into that nitty-gritty drug definition here in a couple slides, but think like medicated moisturizers, or maybe you have like a moisturizing product that also has an acne medication in it. That product would be both a cosmetic and a drug. You can also have a product that is a soap and a drug. So think like antibacterial soap. We commonly see that a lot as like the gold bars of Dial, the antibacterial Dial. Um, Also note some products are automatically considered a drug based on the ingredients that are put into that product. So there are some ingredients that automatically would make a product a drug, regardless of its intended use, because those ingredients that are placed into the product have a widely known or a commonly known therapeutic use, then those ingredients would automatically make that product a drug. So, one resource that I find is really helpful for kind of walking through these product categories and talking about intended uses. The FDA has a fact sheet called "Is it a cosmetic, a drug, or both, or is it soap?" There's a link to that fact sheet on this slide. That QR code will also take you to this webpage. This really breaks down. How the laws define cosmetics and drugs. It explains how products can fall into both categories, how intended use is established, those sorts of things. So if you have more sort of in-depth questions as we move through this presentation, you can refer back to this fact sheet from FDA. So still on the topic of intended use, this next slide will cover some of the ways that intended use can be established for soap and cosmetic products. So the Food and Drug Administration says that there are multiple ways that intended use can be established, with that first one being that claims about the product are made on product labeling, in advertising, on the internet, or in other promotional materials. So if you put somewhere on the package or on the product labeling, or even in advertising for a product, and you state that it moisturizes or it cleanses, or you make some other kind of claim about the function or the use of the product, you're establishing that intended use there. Uh, the FDA goes on to say that if a manufacturer claims that a product can moisturize or beautify the skin, that even if the product is sold as a cleanser, so you can have cosmetic products marketed or labeled as a cleanser, but that product is still recognized as a cosmetic by the FDA because it has claims that the product moisturizes or beautifies or promotes attractiveness in the skin, even though it's also cleansing. Consumer perception, this is also another one that can be kind of tricky in establishing intended use. So consumer perception, this can be established through the product's reputation, and you can kind of feel out consumer perception or get an idea of what your consumers think the intended use of the product is by simply asking them, why are you buying this product? What do you expect it to do? So, if a consumer purchases a product that is meant to have, or if the consumer perceives that a product is meant to have cosmetic properties. So maybe they're using it, maybe it's a scented lotion and the manufacturer meant for it to do one thing, but because the scent in it is so strong, they're seeing that as perfuming the skin, then that product would be categorized as a cosmetic based on that consumer perception because the consumer is using it more as a way to perfume the skin, then it falls into that cosmetic category. Um, and even with just moisturizing, same thing. That moisturizing intended use would categorize that cosmetic or categorize that product as a cosmetic. And these slides are pretty wordy. So if I'm going too fast or if I need to kind of explain something a little better, feel free to kind of stop me um, and ask to do that. So this next slide, we will talk about intended use and making product claims for drug-like benefits. So we mentioned already that there are some ingredients that can be placed into a product that automatically makes that product a drug even if the manufacturer means for it to be a lotion or like a body butter. Um, Along those same lines, there are some claims that manufacturers can make about intended use that force a product to be considered a drug, even if their intent is to only market that as a cosmetic. So the FDA provides a handful of factors that force or establish intended use for a product as a drug. These include making any sort of claim that the product is used to treat or prevent disease or otherwise affect the structure or functions of the human body. So if you have a lotion or a body butter and you place an essential oil into that, and then you market that product and say, this lotion with this essential oil will treat eczema, or this will treat arthritis pain, or this will treat joint pain, or prevent XYZ, that product is automatically going to be considered a drug because you're making drug-like claims for this product. Some other specific examples from FDA drug claims that force a product into that drug category include saying that a product restores hair growth, reduces cellulite, treats varicose veins, increases or decreases melanin in the skin, or regenerates cells. Any kind of medical-like benefit, that product is a drug. Um, Same thing with that consumer perception we talked about earlier. So if the consumer perceives that your product is treating XYZ, if they're using it to treat eczema, then that product is intended to be used as a drug, even if that's not the manufacturer's intended use for the product. We also talked about those ingredients, so those well-known to the public and industry therapeutic uses. The most common ingredient example that the FDA gives for an ingredient that automatically makes something a drug would be fluoride in toothpaste. So any kind of toothpaste with fluoride included in that you get at the grocery store, that's automatically considered a drug because that fluoride is treating um, cavities and or preventing other things from happening to the teeth. All right. So moving into this next slide, where this talks about the legal definition of a cosmetic product. So this is pulled directly from FDA, actually pulled from a section of the FD&C Act. So The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines cosmetics as articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. The most common kind of product categories that the FDA uses as an example for cosmetic products include skin moisturizers, perfumes, lipsticks, fingernail polishes, makeup, cleansing shampoos, perms, so permanent waves, any kind of hair treatment like that, hair colors, deodorants, so not antiperspirants, but strictly deodorant, as well as any substance intended for use as a component of a cosmetic product. So one caveat with cosmetics, they are not meant to alter the appearance of the customer that's using them for more than 24 hours. So all these things are temporary or permanent. Um, Cosmetics are not meant to alter or change the appearance for over that 24-hour time period. All right. So we mentioned MOCRA earlier. That's that Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act. So MOCRA added in an addition to the legal definition of cosmetics in 2022. This is found in Section 361 of the FD&C Act, and this just states that MOCRA amended the FD&C Act to include cosmetic product, which is defined as a preparation of cosmetic ingredients with a qualitatively and quantitatively set composition for use in a finished product. So this is maybe more so of an industry term, or something that they would use in industry. It's just including cosmetic product into that legal definition of cosmetics. One other thing to mention about the definitions of cosmetics and labeling claims. I go ahead and put this in this version of the slide set, or in this section of the slide set here with definitions instead of with some of the labeling discussion we'll have later, because I want to bring your attention to the fact that the FDA does not recognize cosmeceutical as a type of product. So this is another one of those industry terms. The cosmetic industry uses cosmeceutical widely, to just refer to cosmetic products that have medicinal or drug-like benefits. So the FDA is pretty clear on this. A product can be a cosmetic, a drug, or both, but cosmeceutical is not a recognized type of product under the FD&C Act. Products that are both cosmetics and drug products must adhere to cosmetic regulations outlined by the FDA, but also drug regulations outlined by the FDA. Those are much more difficult to navigate, and we will not touch on drug regulations at all in this presentation. Just know that if you have a cosmetic that's also a drug, you have to follow the cosmetic rules and the drug rules outlined by the Food and Drug Administration. Okay, so this brings us into a little bit more of a deeper discussion on soap. So I kind of want to talk through with you all now about using soap as a common name versus that true soap name that we have talked about over the last couple of slides. So we mentioned earlier that not every product that a consumer would consider soap is actually really labeled or categorized as a soap under the law. So true soaps are only those products that are made via saponification and do not include detergents, cleansers, or other items that we commonly call soap. So true bar soap or true soap made via saponification is classified as soap. The FDA recognizes it as that. The Consumer Product Safety Commission recognizes it as that. Those true soap products are regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Detergents, cleansers, body wash, all those things like that, even though we categorize those as soaps in layman's terms as consumers, those are not true soaps and they are regulated by either the FDA or another entity besides the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So, like body washes, shampoos, things like that, those are considered cosmetics and fall under the FDA. So, keep that in mind while we have this discussion about soaps versus true soap. All right. This takes us to the legal definition of a true soap product. So the Food and Drug Administration only classifies a product as soap if the bulk of the non-volatile matter in the product consists of an alkali salt of fatty acids, and the product's detergent properties are due to the alkali fatty acid compounds. So all that means is that you made that true soap product through saponification. It goes through the chemical reaction that happens during that saponification process, and it cleanses due to that chemical reaction between the alkali and the fats and oils. Also, the product is only labeled, sold, and represented as soap. So you couldn't have a bar soap and claim that it does XYZ beyond what true soap is supposed to do. So true soap is only meant for cleansing. If it moisturizes, if it's antibacterial or anything like that, then it ventures back into that cosmetic or that drug category. So any product that meets this definition of soap as outlined by the Food and Drug Administration are regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Commission in the United States. I know that gets kind of confusing because FDA talks about true soaps in the law, but the Consumer Product Safety Commission follows the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act's definition of true soap, and that's what gives the Consumer Product Safety Commission the authority to regulate true soaps. So it has to meet this definition. How can a non-soap product be labeled as soap? So we've talked about that already. We've mentioned kind of body washes, other things that you can find at the grocery store. We know that there are things that are labeled commonly as soap. How does that happen? The Food and Drug Administration in the United States does allow some non-true soap products to be commonly labeled as soap if the only intent for that product is to cleanse the human body. So that product is intended solely for cleansing the human body. It has characteristics that consumers commonly associate with soap, and it does not consist of alkali salts of fatty acids. So if it meets these three categories or these three criteria, but it does not meet the definition of true soap, then it can be commonly identified as soap. So think body wash. It is still required, though, to adhere to all of the cosmetic regulations that the FDA has set forth, because even though we're commonly marketing it as soap, a body wash from Bath and Body Works or Axe body wash at Walmart or whatever else it is that you're looking at, that's not a hard bar of soap, is still a cosmetic at the end of the day. All right. So this takes us now to a little bit of a deeper discussion on MOCRA's impact on cosmetic regulations. So that Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act that we talked about. I mentioned already that MOCRA is the most significant expansion of FDA's authority to regulate cosmetics since the FD&C Act was passed in 1938. The whole point behind MOCRA was to modernize cosmetic regulations in order to protect consumers because there had not been any changes at all to the FD&C Act since 1938 until 2022. So with those MOCRA changes, there were a few other things that come into play. Some more so for larger businesses, some are still kind of important for small businesses. We'll take a look at those. So, MOCRA's specific additions to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act include adverse event record keeping and serious adverse event reporting, mandatory facility registration and product and ingredient listing, cosmetics safety substantiation, and cosmetics labeling and fragrance allergen transparency. So these additions to the FD&C Act took effect in 2023. They were introduced in 2022. And these new requirements, there are some exemptions for small businesses, not every business, but some. If you meet those exemption requirements, you don't necessarily have to do all of these things. But this was just a way for the FDA to modernize cosmetic regulations in the US and work to keep consumers safe. Okay. So, what did these MOCRA additions mean for small businesses? This information on this slide comes from the Personal Care Products Council. So MOCRA's current good manufacturing practices rule, that CGMP, regulations issued by the FDA must offer small businesses flexibility, simplified requirements, and an extended compliance period. So when these regulations took effect in 2023, there was a push from organizations like the Personal Care Products Council to make sure that small businesses had enough time to adapt and comply with the new regulations that affected them. So the biggest one here that I want to draw your attention to is right here in the middle. Um, Small businesses are required to maintain health-related adverse event reports for 3 years instead of the 6 years that are required of larger businesses. So again, going back to that flexibility and the simplified requirements for small businesses, um, having to keep those records for only 3 years versus six, that eases a little bit of the burden for small businesses making soaps and cosmetics. And in addition to that, certain small businesses, this is outlined specifically in MOCRA, are generally exempt from compliance with good manufacturing practices and the facility and product registration requirements. So, those MOCRA exemptions that we just mentioned, they only apply to some small businesses. Under MOCRA, this states that manufacturers of the following products are not exempt from good manufacturing practices, facility registration, and product listing requirements. So if you're a small business, even if you're under $1 million in sales, if you're a small business and you are creating products that regularly come into contact with the mucous membrane of the eye under customary or usual conditions of use, so anything that has to do with like lash lines, things like that with the eyes, products that are injected, so any kind of injectable cosmetic product, something like that. Um, any type of product that is meant for internal use. So if they're ingesting something, if it's meant to be used internally, or products that are intended to alter the appearance for more than 24 hours under customary or usual conditions of use, and removal by the consumer is not part of such conditions of use. So I would say like fake lashes that are supposed to be worn for longer than 24 hours, things like that. Those MOCRA exemptions for small businesses do not apply to those products. So Anyone making these types of products still have to comply with good manufacturing practices for cosmetics. They still have to register their facility and adhere to those product listing requirements from FDA. There is a webinar from the Food and Drug Administration that goes over MOCRA's key terms and provisions. So there's a link to that here. This came out shortly after some of those changes to the FD&C Act were announced. And this is kind of a nice overview of some of those most important concepts of the MOCRA changes. This next slide touches on restricted and prohibited cosmetic ingredients. So we talked about some ingredients earlier that automatically would make a product a drug. There are some ingredients that are completely not allowed, they're prohibited, or you can only use certain amounts of them in cosmetic products in the United States. So this is a list from the Food and Drug Administration. They also have a fact sheet online that goes a little bit more in depth on these prohibited and restricted ingredients. There's a link to that there. So some of the biggest ones I would kind of draw your attention to would be sunscreens in cosmetics. And that may come as a surprise for some folks. So if you use sunscreen anywhere on the cosmetic label or include any sort of sunscreen ingredient into a cosmetic, that automatically makes that product a drug. So be very careful with sunscreens and then these other types of prohibited or restricted ingredients. You can see here this prohibited cattle materials. We'll talk about this on the next slide. That has more to do with tallow, similar types of ingredients or products like that. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a section about prohibited cattle materials, and I'll read this to you. This is pulled straight from that FD&C Act. To protect against BSE, so that's bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also known as mad cow disease, cosmetics may not be manufactured from, processed with, or otherwise contain prohibited cattle materials. And those are outlined below here. You can see there's some word there from the FDA. So prohibited cattle materials do not include tallow that contains no more than 0.15% insoluble impurities, tallow derivatives, hides and hide-derived products, and milk products. So that note about tallow, there is an insoluble impurities test that tallow to be used in cosmetic products has to pass. And I believe this next slide touches on that. It does not. Um, I thought I had a slide in there. We'll talk about this here because this link here, the source for this slide will take you back to this section from FDA. So that part about tallow that contains no more than 0.15% insoluble impurities. There is an American Oil Chemist Society, AOCS, insoluble impurities test that tallow has to pass in order to be used in a cosmetic product and not be considered a prohibited cattle material. So as long as the tallow that's being used in a cosmetic product has less than or up to 0.15% insoluble impurities, you can use that in cosmetic products. I do not have any further information to share about that American Oil Chemist Society test. You can purchase, there is a manual from the American Oil Chemist Society that talks a little bit about that insoluble impurities testing in depth. We are working with other folks on campus with UT in the food science department and some folks involved in the chemistry department to get some clarification on that test and to be able to share that information with producers. So I know this is a little confusing, maybe a little bit of a fuzzy slide to talk about, but just know we're trying to pull more information related to that test to be able to share with you guys. So just know you can't use tallow or any kind of cattle material from like a cow you find on the side of the road or any anything like that. It needs to come from a sanitary place. This mentions that you cannot use material from cattle that has not been inspected and passed. So kind of keep that in mind if you are considering using tallow in cosmetic products. This next slide will touch on laws that regulate cosmetic labeling in the United States. So we touched on that Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act earlier, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, and then I have two specific sections actually of the FD&C Act outlined here for cosmetic labeling. Laws that regulate soap labeling in the United States. So, per the Consumer Product Safety Commission, there are not any specific labeling regulations for true soap products. The Consumer Product Safety Commission states that if the product does not meet the definition of a hazardous substance under the Federal Hazardous Substance Act, then there are no specific labeling requirements. So as long as your soap product is not deemed hazardous under that FHSA, then there are no specific labeling requirements for true soaps. A cautionary labeling guide or statement from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So I mentioned that Federal Hazardous Substance Act. If the soap product does meet the requirement of a hazardous substance under FHSA, then it is required to bear a cautionary labeling statement. So cautionary labeling under that Federal Hazardous Substance Act is kind of outlined below there. It needs to include a signal word, the common or usual name or chemical name of the hazardous substance. It has to have the name of the place or business of the manufacturer, packer, distributor, or seller. There is more information from the Consumer Product Safety Commission online about that Federal Hazardous Substance Act, and you can learn more information about ways to kind of make sure that your product is not considered a hazardous substance. Then you would be able to avoid this cautionary labeling entirely. So there's a little bit more information about that FHSA. How do I know if my soap is hazardous? The Federal Hazardous Substance Act deems a product to be hazardous if it's toxic, corrosive, is an irritant, is a strong sensitizer, if it's flammable or combustible, um, generates pressure through decomposition, heat, or other means. And this last one, I think this one is the most important, must have potential to cause substantial personal injury or illness as a result of standard use, including reasonably foreseeable ingestion by children. So if it's any kind of toxic corrosive, if it's flammable, especially if it would harm an adult or a child, if they ingested that, then it would meet that hazardous substance definition. Sorry, guys, forgive me. I had to sneeze. I'm so sorry. It is that time of year here with allergies and other things in Tennessee, so it is starting to get to me. All right. So we've moved through that on Federal Hazardous Substances Act. This next slide is a fact sheet from the FDA. So this is a summary of cosmetics labeling. There's a link to that on the slide here. The QR code will also take you there. I think this slide is very helpful. especially for folks that have more questions about cosmetic labeling specifically. And just for the sake of time and questions, I think these next couple of slides I'm going to move through quickly because we will have this recording, and I'll also get you guys a copy of these slides in the follow-up email. I just don't want us to run out of time, and I want to make sure that if you guys have any questions, you can ask those at the end of the presentation. So this next slide goes over what has to appear on a cosmetic label. There are a handful of things that the Food and Drug Administration requires a cosmetic product to bear. So it has to have a statement of identity. That includes the product name and the nature of the cosmetic, the legal name and address of the business. So if this could either be the legal name of the manufacturer and the address of that manufacturer, or if it's distributed by someone else, then you would need to put distributed by XYZ. It also needs to have a net quantity of contents declaration, so that's kind of like the net weight. This graphic here shows that they have to appear in certain places. The cosmetics labeling guide from the Food and Drug Administration also outlines that. So some of these sections have to go on specific parts of the container or on parts of the label, and then any cosmetic warnings, if applicable for your product, then you would have to put those cosmetic warnings on there. So information panels, similarly to food labeling, if you guys have encountered any of the regulations surrounding food labeling in the past, cosmetic products have similar information panels. So uh, cosmetic products are required to have what we call a principal display panel, a PDP, and an information panel or an IP. You may be familiar with those from food products as well. So this principal display panel, this is going to be the part of the label or the packaging that the consumer sees first. So the most prominent section or side of the label. And I've actually got something here. I don't know if it will show you guys this on the screen or not. I bet it won't, because I'll have to put it in front of my face. So like this is a bottle of sunscreen. That would be the principal display panel because when it faces the customer on the shelf, that's going to be the first thing that they see is that principal display panel. So that's going to have the product name and identity, the net content and weight statement, and then an ingredient list. And you also have to include any allergens for the cosmetic product on that principal display panel. This graphic goes over the size of a principal display panel or PDP sizing based on package type. So as we all know, cosmetic products can come in all different shapes and sizes of containers and packaging options, and the size of the PDP will change based on that. This graphic comes from an art company that deals in cosmetic packaging, art, that sort of thing. I felt that this was a little bit easier to read than the cosmetic labeling guide. Um, the cosmetic labeling guide from FDA is super helpful, but it is very lengthy and can be difficult to flip through. So this is a little bit of an easier way to digest that information. So just keep in mind that depending on the packaging type or the product type, that principal display panel will look different. The sizes, the font type, that sort of thing will be different. So this next slide is a caveat about cosmetic labeling and listing that legal business info, excuse me. I mentioned this already, I think once. Um, so if a cosmetic is manufactured or distributed by you or whatever your business name is, and there's no one else involved, when you list that legal business information for that cosmetic product, then you would put your legal business name and address on the product. If the cosmetic is manufactured by, distributed by, whatever, by someone that is not you, then you have to put manufactured for, distributed by, some sort of statement like that identifies you were not the person, or your business was not the person that distributed that product. So keep that in mind when it comes to listing legal business information for cosmetics. This next slide is just another example of a principal display panel and information panel for a cosmetic product. So, as I mentioned, I think already, cosmetics can come in like several different boxes, especially like women's cosmetic products or skincare products. Usually there's like a cardboard box that package would come in, and then there's either the tube or the glass bottle or the dropper, whatever the product is. Um, so you can have a principal display panel and an information panel on that cardboard box. You also have to have those on the actual product itself. So if you've ever opened, like in the United States, if you've ever opened like a sunscreen, there's like a little insert inside, and then there's the cardboard box, and then there's the actual like tube of sunscreen that has information on both sides of the bottle. Um, those are just some examples. This is also an example of an outer container. So again, we talked about cardboard box. That would be the outer container versus that inner. Um, Packaging would be the product itself. Here's another inner container example. So same thing with some of the other products I mentioned. I actually think this sunscreen tube I showed you guys at one time had like a little um, flap that pulls out with more information about the product. This is just going to be that information panel versus the principal display panel here. So just examples. There are some factors that will determine the readability of a cosmetic label. So that's just whether how easy it is for the consumer to read what's on the package. So, panel display, panel size, warning statements, and background contrast can all directly influence how readable that cosmetic label is. So, it's important to kind of keep those things in consideration when putting a cosmetic label together. This next slide is just a breakdown of label readability based on panel size. So that size of the principal display area in square inches and the corresponding font size in inches that you should use. So if you've got a between like a 25 square inch to 100 square inch principal display panel, you would want to use a font size that's 3/16 of an inch. Again, I've got a link that goes back to these tables here if you want more information on that. The cosmetics labeling guide from FDA breaks this down in depth. So it gets pretty deep into the information for like font size, how how high the type should be, specific things like that. I have mentioned that FDA cosmetic labeling guide a few times now. This QR code will take you to that document. That link on this slide will as well. So this is an exhaustive overview of all of the provisions, regulations, information related to cosmetic labeling from the Food and Drug Administration. So this is kind of like the cosmetic labeling Bible, if you will. One other thing I want to draw your attention to as we start to get towards the end here, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act prohibits cosmetics to be sold or distributed if they are considered adulterated or misbranded. So an adulterated product, it contains a substance that could make the product harmful to consumers if it is unsanitary, filthy, maybe there's decomposed substances in there. Um, Adulterated products are those that are harmful to consumers in some way. Or if it is not a hair dye and it has a non-permittive color additive in that product, then it's also considered an adulterated cosmetic. So when it comes to like interstate commerce for cosmetics, the Food and Drug Administration prohibits adulterated and misbranded cosmetic products. So those are illegal to sell, and especially across state lines. So interstate commerce, that becomes a big deal. And anyone that is involved in like the supply chain of those cosmetic products. So the manufacturer, the distributor, the if you've got somebody else that's packing the product for you, if anyone in that supply chain is involved in distributing adulterated or misbranded products, that's a big no-no from the FDA, and you could be subject to whatever regulatory action they take based on whatever it is that they find you to be doing improperly. So misbranded products, those are different than adulterated cosmetic products. So a cosmetic is considered misbranded if the label is misleading, if it contains false information, if it's missing the required labeling information, or if the container is filled in a deceptive manner. So kind of like with maybe bags of potato chips. I know people online will talk about, oh, I bought this bag of potato chips and it's only half full, 50% of it's air. Um, s- a similar argument can be made for cosmetic products. So if you only fill the jar up halfway, and so say it's like a 3 ounce jar, but if you've only filled it up to like 1.5 ounces and you're selling that as with a net weight of 3 ounces, that's considered misbranded, and you have filled that container deceptively. So those are prohibited. It's very important that you label anything that's included on that cosmetic label is true and accurate. You include all of the required labeling information set forth by the FDA, and the container is not filled trying to trick consumers into paying for a product when you're not actually giving them the amount that you state that you are. This next slide is a small business and homemade cosmetics fact sheet from the Food and Drug Administration. This one's really nice. It goes in depth into lots of common questions related specifically to small businesses and homemade cosmetics. This fact sheet has been really helpful for me in engaging in this work with producers. There's also a frequently asked questions on soap fact sheet from the FDA. So remember, the regulations for soap products, true soap products, are outlined in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that are set forth by the FDA, but the Consumer Product Safety Commission oversees soap regulations. And this fact sheet goes into that. There's another page. These next couple of slides are some soap business guidance from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So there's a screenshot to this link there. This is just some helpful information about true soaps. Some of that information we've covered already. The Consumer Product Safety Commission also has what's called a regulatory robot. So this thing's pretty cool. It is an online tool that helps you figure out what type of regulations apply to your product. So these next couple of slides will kind of show you what that report would look like. When you enter into the regulatory robot, there's an option for you to title the report that it will give you at the end. So notice I named this one soap information, and then you'll move through and select product categories. So soap products fall under this section down here. So art materials, chemical cleaning, hazardous substances, fireworks and fire-related products. You click there, and then a couple more questions will pop up inside the regulatory robot. So it will ask you, is your product a soap composed mainly of fats, oils, and alkalis? If you say yes, then it will prompt you with another question. Is this product made for children? There are some really in-depth requirements for children's products. So I would be very careful if you are marketing a soap product specifically to children. There's a lot of additional testing that that product would need to go through, that the Consumer Product Safety Commission outlines. So if you mark no, then that would take you to the end of the slide. You'd get a customized final report. And that report from the regulatory robot will look like this. So here's what the title of the report. We named it SOAP information. There's a table of contents, all this other helpful information that the regulatory robot has put together for you. This next Soap and Cosmetic Resources, the Personal Care Products Council. So I mentioned those folks earlier. This is like a third-party industry group. They were very involved in kind of the lobbying for and the work that went into the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act. So they're just a third-party resource not affiliated with FDA or the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Same thing with the Handcrafted Soap and Cosmetics Guild. So the HSCG is another third-party resource. They exist as an organization that soap makers and cosmetic producers can join. This is meant more so for like smaller businesses, folks that are trying to navigate these small business regulations. They offer several tools and resources. They do events from time to time. They have member showcases. But again, they're a third-party organization not affiliated with the FDA or the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Some of those tools and resources from the HSCG, they have MOCRA resources. They also have product and price calculators and then classes. So just keep in mind if you use those product and price calculators, that's pulled together from the Guild. It's not affiliated with FDA or the CPSC, and it would kind of be like a use at your own risk situation if you relied on their product or price calculators. But they have a lot of neat resources online available to folks. This is another look at those calculators. So they have a lye calculator, a price calculator, and then an ingredient database. But this is all third party, so not affiliated with FDA or anything like that. Now, these tools are free, so keep that in mind. And if you become a member of the Handcrafted Soap and Cosmetic Guild, you can access more functionality, including ingredient declaration. But you would have to join and become a member for some of that. So that brings us to kind of the end of this presentation. We went a little bit over time, but that's okay. There's still enough folks on the call. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat at any time. And I may have missed one. I want to check and see. I did not. So you guys feel free to ask questions if you have those. If I need to go back to something, I can. This is my contact information. So if you guys need to get in touch with me for any reason, my email's on there, as well as my direct line. The center's website is available online at any time at cpa.tennessee.edu. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram, and then our YouTube channel is listed down at the bottom there. So you'll be able to find this webinar, the recording for this webinar, once we get that uploaded after the live session ends today at our CPA YouTube channel. And for our folks on the call who are Tennessee producers and need that TAEP educational credit, this evaluation form is where you will record and track your attendance for this session. For my other folks on the call, if you are looking for a way to provide feedback and kind of share additional information about your experience with Daring to Learn today or otherwise, feel free to do that in this space. This is not just for those producers that are looking to track attendance for TAEP. Your feedback is super helpful. It helps us find speakers and identify topics for the month-to-month sessions and kind of pan out where we're going next. So anything that you guys have to share would be super helpful. If you have any questions, I'll hang out for just a few more minutes. I'll keep the recording going as well to make sure we capture any of those for the recorded session. But otherwise, you guys are free to go, and I will see you on April the 14th. Our next session in April will be covering digital marketing strategies for farm businesses. I will be presenting for that next session next month, so look forward to having you guys back. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy your Tuesday, and I will see you in a few weeks.